Welcome back, A-level learners, to this explainer. Today we're diving straight into an incredible 60-year narrative arc, the wild swing of the British political pendulum. We're tracking everything from the dust settling after the First World War right up to the pivotal election of Margaret Thatcher in 1979. We've got a ton of ground to cover to help with your studies, from shattered coalitions and absolute economic collapse to the birth of the welfare state and the absolute chaos of the winter of discontent. Let's get started. Okay, to anchor our revision today, we're going to break this massive era down into 5 chronological stages. We'll hit the post-World War I shift, the era of depression and war, building the welfare state, the golden age of the post-war consensus, and finally how that consensus violently broke down.
Starting right off with Section 1, the post-World War I political shift.
So, the political landscape of the early 20th century was completely rewritten by one massive catalyst, and that was the huge expansion of the British electorate. For our period, the absolutely crucial turning point is the 1918 Representation of the People Act. This gave the vote to nearly all men over 21 and women over 30 who met specific property qualifications. To put that into perspective, we're talking about the electorate jumping from roughly 7.7 million voters to a staggering 21.4 million. This influx completely changed the game. It actually tripled the conservative voter base, since they successfully appealed to aspirational property-owning classes. But critically, it just poured fuel on the rise of the Labour Party among the newly enfranchised working class. And the immediate fallout of this? Well, it was dramatic. In the 1922 general election, the Conservatives absolutely dominated, with 344 seats, while Labour surged to 142. But the Liberals? They were completely fractured. David Lloyd George's coalition had essentially fallen apart after the threat of war with Turkey and the Chinac crisis, coupled with a really damaging scandal over selling peerages for party funds. The Liberals basically became a politically spent force, and that power vacuum paved the way for Ramsay MacDonald to form the very first, albeit pretty short-lived, Labour government in 1924. However, Labour's meteoric rise definitely wasn't unchallenged. Following the massive disruption of the 1926 general strike, Conservative Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin made a highly strategic move. He went right for Labour's wallet. The 1927 Trades Disputes Act changed union political levies from an automatic opt-out system to a voluntary opt-in one. The result? A devastating 35% drop in Labour's finances. It effectively kneecapped their momentum for the rest of the decade. Moving into Section 2, Depression, Extremism, and War. You know, the Roaring Twenties ended pretty abruptly, giving way to severe economic crises in the 1930s that tested the very fabric of the British government. By 1931, Ramsay MacDonald was back in power with a second Labour government, but the Great Depression was just ravaging the economy. Unemployment was skyrocketing, and foreign banks were threatening to pull their money entirely if Britain didn't balance its budget. This tension led to a fatal cabinet split. MacDonald and his chancellor wanted to slash unemployment benefits to save the pound. The majority of his Labour cabinet, they absolutely refused. So MacDonald resigned, only to immediately form a conservative-dominated national government. They pushed through harsh 10% public sector pay cuts and completely abandoned the gold standard, unpegging the pound's value to devalue the currency. To the Labour Party, MacDonald's actions weren't just political maneuvering, they were seen as a profound, unforgivable betrayal. Now, intense economic misery like this fostered political extremes all across Europe, and Britain was definitely no exception. A disillusioned politician named Oswald Mosley formed the British Union of Fascists, which swelled to about 50,000 members by 1934. But notice how the British state responded here. The 1936 Public Order Act banned political uniforms. It literally stripped the black shirts of their intimidating visuals. It was a targeted legislative strike that diminished Mosley's entire movement. This is a key takeaway for your A-levels. Parliamentary democracy neutrally and effectively dealt with extremism right at the height of the Depression. While domestic extremism was being handled, international threats were mounting fast. Neville Chamberlain is, of course, heavily associated with his policy of appeasing Hitler, but we often forget he was simultaneously trying to rearm Britain. By 1937, the actual cost of rearmament hit a staggering £1.5 billion. Just 3 years earlier, Chamberlain actually believed he could do it for a mere $120 million. He desperately struggled to balance the spiraling, massive costs of necessary military readiness with an economy that was still just trying to recover. But international crises rapidly overshadowed domestic politics anyway. The Italian invasion of Abyssinia, Hitler marching into the Rhineland, the outbreak of the Spanish Civil War, Japan invading China, the dominoes were falling everywhere you looked. Ultimately, the policy of appeasement failed, war broke out, and by May 1940, Winston Churchill took over the wartime coalition, leading Britain through its darkest hours. Which brings us to Section 3, Building the Welfare State. The Second World War literally changed everything. It left a nation absolutely desperate for domestic reform and security after years of extreme sacrifice. The 1945 general election results absolutely shocked the world. Winston Churchill, the enormously popular wartime hero, was decisively voted out. Labour achieved a massive landslide, with 393 seats to the Conservatives' 210. Why did this happen? Well, the British public wasn't voting on the past anymore. They were voting for the future. They wanted a new, socially secure Britain, and they trusted Labour to build it. Labour's manifesto was boldly titled, "Let us face the future," and it laid out the exact blueprint. Under Prime Minister Clement Attlee, they passed incredibly transformative legislation. They established the National Health Service in 1948, created comprehensive social security and national insurance, pushed through new housing acts, and nationalised key industries like coal and the railways. They successfully built the modern welfare state. But, and this is absolutely vital to remember for your exams, it came at a massive cost. To fund all of this, Britain had to endure immense taxation, the top rate hit 90 pence in the pound, and they faced strict austerity, extending to the point where even bread had to be rationed in 1947, which didn't even happen during the war. Next up, Section 4, the post-war consensus. Despite public fatigue with that austerity, which did lead to Labour losing power in 1951, their core ideas actually survived, and here is a crucial concept you need to know: Butzkellism. It's a clever blend of the names of Conservative Chancellor Rab Butler and Labour's Hugh Gaitskell, and it brilliantly illustrates how both major parties largely just accepted the new status quo. Successive Conservative governments throughout the 1950s did not dismantle the welfare state. Instead, they actually embraced state intervention, full employment, and mixed economy principles. And honestly, for a while, it worked beautifully. Conservative Prime Minister Harold Macmillan famously declared in 1957, "Most of our people have never had it so good." That one quote perfectly captures the rising living standards, the end of rationing, and just the general economic optimism that really defined Britain in the 1950s. Abroad, however, reality was biting hard. The 1956 Suez Crisis was a massive watershed moment. When Britain and France invaded Egypt to retake the nationalized Suez Canal, the USA and the USSR firmly opposed them. They basically forced a totally humiliating withdrawal, and Prime Minister Anthony Eden had to resign. But more importantly, Suez brutally demonstrated that Britain could no longer act as an independent imperial power on the world stage without American backing. Things had fundamentally shifted. Finally, Section 5, the consensus breaks down. Let's see how all this builds to a breaking point. As we enter the late 1960s and 70s, economic strain, high inflation, and union power started tearing the post-war consensus apart. Take Labour Prime Minister Harold Wilson, for example. He came to power promising to modernize Britain, but he inherited some very deep economic problems. So you have to ask, did he keep his solemn promise not to devalue the pound? Nope. By 1967, extreme economic pressures forced a really humiliating devaluation. This severely damaged public trust in his Labour government. It started showing everyone that the state was losing its grip on managing the economy. Then, in 1970, conservative Edward Heath tried to break the consensus entirely. He wanted less state intervention, but his strategy unraveled incredibly quickly. First, his chancellor's Barber budget pumped massive tax cuts into the economy, which unfortunately triggered out-of-control inflation. Panicking, Heath performed a massive U-turn in 1972, reverting right back to state intervention. Finally, this all culminated in the 1973 miners' strike, where energy shortages were so severe Heath actually had to impose a 3-day work week just to keep the lights on. He was completely trapped by inflation and crushed by union pushback. Labour returned to power in 1974, absolutely desperate to restore some kind of order. Harold Wilson introduced what he called the social contract. The idea was pretty simple. The government would offer subsidies and friendly legislation in exchange for trade unions moderating their wage claims. It was a desperate attempt to use the old consensus playbook to try and control spiraling inflation. But ultimately, it just failed. Prices kept rising, and wages kept desperately chasing them. By the late 70s, under new Prime Minister James Callaghan, the Labour Party itself was fundamentally fracturing. It's really fascinating. On the center right, you had Callaghan and his chancellor Dennis Healey quietly abandoning the consensus, actually embracing monetarism, which means focusing on controlling the money supply to curb inflation, even if it meant letting go of the commitment to full employment. Meanwhile, on the hard left, figures like Tony Benn were demanding radical alternatives, a total siege economy, and pulling out of the European Economic Community. The ideological glue that held the post-war consensus together had completely dissolved.
All of this built up to a visceral, totally chaotic climax, the winter of discontent in 1978 and 79. Frustrated by government caps on pay during periods of really high inflation, widespread public sector strikes basically brought the entire country to a halt. And we're not just talking about miners anymore. It was dustmen, hospital staff, and even gravediggers. Rubbish literally piled up in Leicester Square, and tragically, bodies were left unburied in Liverpool. It was an absolute disaster that completely destroyed Callaghan's poll ratings. Which brings us to the end of our 60-year journey today. Out of the chaos of the winter of discontent, the British public voted in Margaret Thatcher and the Conservatives in 1979 with a sizable majority. They were promised a radical break from the past. But I want to leave you with a final thought to ponder as you prepare for your exams. As that political pendulum swung to Thatcher in 1979, was the era of the post-war consensus, that mix of the welfare state, a mixed economy, and union cooperation, really gone forever? Or was it merely waiting to be reinvented by a future generation? Definitely keep that in mind as you review your notes. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and happy studying.